Today on Ascend the Great Books podcast, we welcome Jason Craig of Sword and Spade magazine. We're going to focus on Telemachus and his coming-of-age story and couple that with the fatherhood of Odysseus. We'll see what kind of lessons there are for those of us who are fathers in this text. Now, just a general warning, there are a few spoilers if you're just completely unaware of the general narrative of the Odyssey. But overall, this is a great introduction and really picks up the theme of fatherhood and sonship in the Odyssey. So join us for a wonderful conversation with Jason Craig.
Welcome to Ascend the Great Books podcast. Go to ascendthegreatbookspodcast.com to find out all about the Iliad. We just got done with the Iliad. And going into the Odyssey, I'm really excited about this opportunity to continue this year of Homer. As we've talked about Deacon before, we finally have a good understanding of what the Iliad is and being able to teach this to our children, which is very important. And this is like one of the main reasons why I am in love with the great books and wanting to take on this adventure with you. But we also have a very special guest this evening, which I'm really pumped to talk to. I've been a fan from afar for a long time, which is kind of sounds a little weird, but I still am. I'm really excited to have Jason Craig here with us. He's the editor of Those Catholic Men. He's the editor of Sword and Spade, Fraternus. You're kind of the ringleader of that.
Is that your title? That'd be an awesome title.
Ringleader
I am ringleader.
Fraternus?
Yeah, it says it on my ringleader of
Yeah, I wasn't sure. Like, is it a corporation or is it like just a like? I was like, that's not right. It's not a corporation.
It's a
just
serfdom.
serfdom.
Yeah.
Okay,
I like that.
I like that.
It's a feudal system.
So yeah, it's great to have you. You're also friends with several of our friends like Jared Stout, Dr. Jared Stout, Dr. Cutterback. Did you know Brendan Sheard as well, or is that how we?
Well, I have to claim it now. You said it on camera. But
Yeah,
he's the butcher.
Yeah, he's the butcher.
Well, we got our own. We had
Yeah, you
across
do.
the street. We have a new up and coming Catholic butcher.
Okay.
He couldn't be here because he's butchering.
Which would make sense.
yeah.
Yes, and you're a father of how many?
8.
8.
Wonderful. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Yeah, 5 boys, 3 girls.
5 boys, 3 girls.
Yeah, that's right.
That's awesome.
I felt it necessary to say 5 boys since we're talking about the Odyssey.
Since we're talking about
Yeah,
the
no, that's a good
good.
introduction.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Sword and Spade?
It's a magazine that grew out of the apostolate with Fraternus that a lot of people I know they're trying to grab men, they're trying to do man stuff, and sometimes it can get weird or you don't really know what to do. When I said it could get weird, you looked at Adam.
I was just thinking of the Catholic Man Show. The Catholic Man Show podcast gets weird sometimes.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, how it's been going that many years. You got it.
Yeah, it's
what are you gonna
year
do?
7. It's going to get weird.
Yeah. What are you going to do?
Yeah.
But when it comes to men, they all want to be a good dad. So if you say something like, "Oh, the universal call to holiness," whatever. But if you say everyone wants to be a good dad, yeah, I want to be a good dad. And in Fraternus, it is not. Fraternus is not, despite our best efforts at communicating this, is not about boys. Reaching boys because the boys live with you. What do you mean you can't reach them? You know where they live. You drive them everywhere. It's really about the dads that if we don't begin in our brotherhood and our own formation, that's where it starts. Then we can say to our sons, "Hey, come join us." Not, "Hey, we put together this program and we're going to inflict on you." But we have a brotherhood and we want you to join us. That's how men are made. But in that, there was, a lot of us who, especially if we're converts or late to maturing in our faith, we realize the deficit. Like, all right, I'm the primary formator in my home. I'm the father, and I don't know anything. I don't know much. So a lot of us, we might scan the internet. We're looking at things, and it's okay. But a lot of us know we don't read. We don't have good habits. Christianity is a reading religion. Long before there was any rubrics for the laity, there's been rubrics for the books, in our liturgies. What do you do with books? It's what we do. We preserve, we read, we study, we pass on books. We are, as Islam calls us, a religion of the book. A lot of dads don't read, which they recognize as a problem. And so Sword and Spade began as a bridge, so to speak, between better habits of reading. And reading on a page, without even having to go into the studies. We all know it's better. You remember it. If you say, how many articles did you read last week on the internet? 30. Name one. And usually you only name the title, right?
Right.
A gotcha title, and it's like you're either with the title or not before you even read the article. But when you go through something on a page and you read through it and you're actually digesting, much like the spirit of this podcast, something different happens. That was the idea. The other idea was to give men in communities something to talk about that is substantial,
Right.
meaningful conversation. And these aren't just Catholic topics. They're very serious topics on what is our obligation, for example, Catholic business owners who have the freedom to close on a solemnity. Do you? Right. So we have one of my favorite articles we ever ran was from some mechanics in Birmingham that are fraternist guys that closed their shop.
Is it Charlie?
Charlie Rumore.
Yes, I know Charlie.
Yeah.
I've been to his house and met his family.
That's funny.
He's an
love
amazing
Charlie.
guy. He changed the way I viewed just like
Life?
your neighborhood, like and
Yeah.
the people around you.
Right.
Like I have an obligation for my neighbor to raise holy men and women, like because I need somebody to marry, like to marry my daughter, and
Yeah.
I need my sons to marry eligible women.
So Charlie is the co-editor of with me. Maybe he would call himself my editor of every but he. When people say, "Well, what's the magic sauce of Sword and Spade?" It's like, "Well, my co-editor is a mechanic," because they actually own this downtown mechanic shop, which is a very kind of a cultural institution, even of that little downtown area. And on the solemnity of the Assumption or something, they will slap a big close sign and say "Closed for the Assumption." And he's an accountant. They calculate the cost of that, of paying their employees to go home for a Catholic feast in the South. So articles like that are very much. It's not just how to get excited about your faith. Yeah.
Right.
And that example right there of what's the substantive, actionable, practical reality of your faith. That's where you're supposed to love your neighbor. It's love your neighbor, right? I mean, these things are. Christianity is actually agonizingly practical. And the point of that magazine is that fathers, men have very practical burden upon them as fathers and as men in their community, and that us cultivating our communities, our places, and our minds, and by the reading of these books, that's why it's Sword and Spade. Everyone loves the defense, rah man stuff, but the spade is the work of the farmer, right? Cultivating, making a place and a culture worth defending with the sword in the first place.
It's a wonderful name.
Yeah.
I actually I just really enjoy it.
Yeah. People get it wrong all the time. Sword and shield. No, sword, spade.
Spade.
Because God is a warrior, as the Old Testament tells us. But as our Lord says, my father's a farmer. So that's where that comes from, that we spade the ground. So anyway, we've ran some articles on the Odyssey. It's one of the books that we've encouraged men, read this book. I mean, don't be scared of this book.
Right. Yeah, I think as I listened to you kind of talk about Sword and Spade, I think there's a shared ministerial intent there about what we're trying to do with the Sin, the Great Books podcast, is trying to come alongside, men and women, but say like, hey, you can read these great books and we will help you do it, right? Because I think the genesis of this was, Adam and I have this, Sunday Great Books group that meets at my home once a month, on Sundays to read a great text. And we'd go, we have these good conversations. There's lots of men there that honestly are only reading these texts because they want to be able to pass that knowledge on to their kids. Mm-hmm. Their kids are not quite old enough to be reading these books. And so they're trying to catch up, on their reading.
Like catch up, yeah.
Yeah, before their kids get there. And I think that, obviously, I think that's part of your, ministry as well. And then the kind of genesis of this podcast is that we then, just kind of casually started posting on Twitter, like, hey, look, this is the conversation we're having. Look, we're reading this. And just like this outcry that really kind of resonated with my heart because it was heartbreaking of just like, I wish I had this group. I wish I had someone I could read this with. I want to read this. You know what? I'm sympathetic to that because like just picking up the Iliad or picking up the Odyssey and just like reading it cold and not having someone to discuss it with is difficult.
Yeah. So what do you do if you're a guy and this is part of your cultural inheritance? You got your homeschooling kid maybe walking up talking about it, and then your dad like, oh yeah, it sounds great. You want it. And I agree definitely to be able to pass it on to your kids, but also there's something I've missed. This is my inheritance, right? I mean, this is my cultural inheritance, and I didn't even read it. And if I did, and this is me, if I did, it was the Cliff Notes to get through. I'm not classically trained or educated. I'm playing catch up like a lot of men.
Right.
So I feel it. I'm glad
so
you're doing it.
Kind of like kind of jumping off of that point then, so why, if someone asked you, right, why should Catholic men read the Odyssey?
My love for the Odyssey, actually, I knew it was important. There was parts of it I read that I thought were amazing. And I say parts, like, need to finish it. I read a kid's version to my kids out loud over, I don't know, number of weeks or months or however long it took. And just was really moved because I was reading it and thinking about it as I was researching another topic, another book on rites of passage and boys becoming men and fatherlessness and these voids and this father-son dynamic that's in so much classical literature. And I mean, even our own, what is the epic poem, the American poem about the Native American boy who goes off? Hiawatha. My daughter's in the room. She
Yes. Hiawatha.
Yes.
Hiawatha. But these patterns from Hiawatha to the Odyssey to the Karate Kid, there's certain patterns of this need for a man, for mentors, for fathers. And reading the Odyssey in that context was eye-opening for our own struggles today and a fatherless and confused masculinity in our culture. That the Odyssey is the reason it's handed down, and we read it, and you might go when you look at a beautiful landscape or architecture, and you look at it and you say, "Wow, that just works," and you don't know why. One of the reasons the Odyssey just works as something we need to read. You're going to read it and say, "There's something big here." Particularly my interest is the relationship of when Odysseus is getting home, and he finds his father and he finds his son Telemachus. In his sort of weak and effeminate stage. Not to mention Telemachus before he gets there being sent away, and Odysseus's attempt to return home and how he's thwarted. It doesn't mean he's a perfect man, but in his struggles, you're gonna go, yeah, that's it, that's real. So as you look at something that's beautiful and go, that just works. I think a lot of men will read it and think this is resonating. I don't know why. There's some really good reasons why.
Yeah. So when you look at the Odyssey, it sounds like that's the predominant theme that stood out to you when you read it first time, was that relationship between the father and son? Because Odysseus is a really conflicted character. There's also, Homer stacks a lot of different themes going on at one time. That's not the theme that I would have pulled out the first time. I was mainly still trying to get over not liking Odysseus at all, right? I was really kind of tied into the first time I read it with a group. And everyone else in the group was very much like, man, this guy's a great leader. Like, he's really good. And I'm like, did you read the same text I did? Like, what is happening? So I was so kind of wrapped. I mean, this is a critique of myself. This is the problem, not problem, but the challenge, right, with texts that are really multifaceted and have lots of layers. Is like the first time you read through them, you usually pick something out. And for me, I was all wrapped around the axle on Odysseus' character. Is he good? Is he bad? We've read the Iliad, and sometimes you're like the man of tactics, and it's like sometimes I feel like he's using other people as a meat shield. Like, that's right. What's happening here? But he's also connected to the god of wisdom, and she loves him, right? Meat shield, right? Like, sorry, it's a clear picture, and but for you, it sounds like it really was that relationship.
Yeah. Okay. So the conflicting, absolutely. I mean, you can read the Gospels and not like Peter pretty easily, right? I mean, that's good, but that's that humanity that says, okay, I can read this, I can get with this. It's definitely not hagiography with Odysseus. So he's trying to get home. I think the state of his home and the things that keep him from home, and then the things that he finds when he's not in Ithaca, when he arrives there, the things that are going on, that was what was really striking to me. So his son is a great image of the insecurity of a man without a father. So Penelope, his mother, is being wooed by these guys. So these guys are bullies. They are drinking up the goodness of somebody else, eating his storehouse, making fun and laughing at his sons, going after his hot mom. And she is aloof to the fact that he's growing into an effeminate boy. And by effeminate, I don't mean female, like girly. What I mean is, as Aquinas would call effeminate, inability to sacrifice. Why? Because he doesn't know how. He's growing up. He's ready to become a man. And then where's dad? You got all these suitors who could care less about their potential rival becoming a man, right? Do the suitors want him to be a mighty man? Of course not. Then I might not get Penelope and all this cool house. So you've got him there. She's aloof to him, his problems, whatever's going on with him. He is obviously, struggling and with, I don't know, not having his dad around. You've got and then you have there's an interest from a goddess that she knows, oh, for Odysseus' sake, I want this boy to become a man. So she appears. This is just one of these fascinating things that, of course, she's going to go to him, but she doesn't go to him as a female goddess. Even in all her power and her mystery, she appears to him as mentor, right? The friend of the father who was supposed to be watching after his son. That is where we get the word mentor from. It started to be, I believe there was a French priest, scholar who Fenelon, anyway, someone who started using that word based on, they need a mentor.
Right, because mentor is his proper name.
Right.
It's originally an analogy, right? So like Telemachus had mentor, this man that could actually, help him in his coming of age story. So to you need a mentor.
You need a mentor,
right?
And that's how that started to be used. And we use it now as just someone who's, guiding you or whatever. But it was actually, no, the dad's not here. I want him to do something. I want you to make sure my son doesn't get. So actually, that's a conflicted character. Did mentor do his job? Nope. So why do we use that as a good word? To be a mentor is actually to be probably not good. But perhaps we've adopted it and made it better.
But we've baptized it.
We did our best.
That is just a really interesting dynamic to watch as we read the Odyssey, is that simultaneously, as you have this coming home story of Odysseus, right, which tends to capture most of our imagination as we're reading this, because he's the character we know. We saw the battles in Troy, and now we're seeing him in his desperate attempt to get home. Then you also have this secondary narrative that I very much view as like a coming of age story.
Absolutely.
Of Telemachus, right, of him, suffering, I think, under the effects of fatherlessness, right. It's interesting. I'd have to pay attention to that. I never really took, I think the first time I read it, what exactly the relationship between Telemachus and Penelope is. Like how attentive is she actually to the suffering?
She can't. What is she going to give him?
Right.
Masculinity?
Yeah. So at minimum,
Right.
even if she is attentive, right, to his needs, right, she can't be the father to him, right? She can be a mother, but she
And
can't
if
be the
anything,
father.
she'll be protective and not putting him up against the suitors or really any kind of challenge. She's just protecting him.
And I think too that somewhat, say, to use a phrase, teenage angst of Telemachus, maybe to give a slight defense of him, being in his home, right, loving his mother, waiting for his father, right, also his mother and he are like basically the only ones who actually think Odysseus might even be coming back, right, that they're
So
not
they
just
have hope.
presuming him dead,
Right.
so they have some hope. But also just like the angst and frustration of being a young man, seeing your mom taken advantage of, see your father's kingdom being, eaten up, and not being able to really do anything
And
about
to
it.
be surrounded by men that aren't your people, right?
Right.
I mean, these suitors are not his people.
Right.
Now, they should be under him, right? He's the heir to this little kingdom, right? But they're not his people. These people that should be my brothers are my enemies. So he has no men in his life, which is why I think it's fascinating when it's Athena, right?
Yes, Athena, yeah.
Athena appears as mentor to him, where a goddess comes so whatever form she could have taken, she chooses to take the form of a man, and that man says, "You gotta get out of here. You cannot be here and become a man. You cannot." This environment, which is fascinating, when I mentioned that I was reading this as I was researching this book on rites of passage, that traditional societies, the first step, the first stage of maturity is to be separated from your normal household as overseen by your mother. Not that your mom is bad or your household is bad, but that you got to get out of there, because in that environment, you've been a boy your whole life. You've never been a man in that environment. So you're not going to, you don't know how to do this. We got to get you out of here. And I think it's amazing. It's just a really beautiful testament to this truth that you boys have to get out of those environments. So what does Mentor do, or Athena do through Mentor's likeness, is to send him away. And she sends him away to go be with other men, talk with them, in a sense to, I think of our Lord when he's separated even from Our Lady, and well, what's he doing? I'm about my Father's business. He goes around to his Father's business and hears these stories and gets, in a sense, gets the inheritance, at least in the legend of it, the myth of it in a good way, from his father's brothers, from the men that respect and revere his father.
Yeah, he goes to that next generation, right? His father's generation.
Yeah, and he goes around to them, traveling to hear, like, oh, this is what I need to hear. This is who I am.
Yeah, Telemachus very much has his own Odyssey, right, that parallels his father's.
Which begins with, like his father, he's leaving home. Now he's supposed to return home, right? The hero always goes home. That's an important part of, at least classical and true things. The hero goes home. The hero just doesn't go on exploits or whatever. So he's on his way home, but he has to go on his Odyssey, and his dad's on the way back. And for both of them have to have that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And then for his father, I don't know if I'm trying to think of the details of it, but he almost seems confused at the whole matter when he gets there. He's like, why isn't my son's kind of, what's going on with look at my household? Odysseus has to find his father, who's basically, back to the lander at this point, right? He's out spading a tree. He's just, Wendell makes the comment that no one ever notices how reasonable it was when Ithaca's falling apart because the king's not there. Civilization is falling apart. The king is gone. Dad's like, we got to start over. I'm going back to the soil, right? He's sort of back to the lander. And he finds him and Rags, they reconcile, and he's traveling around. And then by the time he finds his son, right, there's a little bit of a tension, but then they go in to defeat this ultimate enemy, which is these men that aren't my brothers. They got to get out of my house.
Right.
Don't give the enemy a seat at the table.
Yeah, it's interesting, I think, as we read the Odyssey, to try and track what is Telemachus's maturation, right? What is it in his coming of age story, like as he moves from a boy to a man, what is he having to learn? And I think maybe more complicated is there a parallel story for Odysseus, right? As he travels home, is there a maturation for him? Is there a character development? Like, is there a lesson that he's learning? I think those are some of the questions that I think Homer presents before us.
Well, I think his salvation is that he makes it home. I mean, that is for all the confusion we might have about his character on the way there. Once he gets there and he throws a spear or whatever he does through the throat of one of the suitors with his son right next to him, you're like, that is right. That is what he should have done, right? He reclaims his place, his kingdom. I mean, his island and his home and his wife and his bed that's made out of a tree and there's something that's still alive. And I don't quite understand how that worked with.
Kind of setting aside some of the details. But yeah, the bed is a unique bed, right? And I think that shows. There's some Homeric imagery there on the relationship between Penelope and Odysseus, right? And does he remember and know about their marriage bed, right? Because there's a unique aspect to it. What about that feminine aspect, though? What about like Penelope sitting here fighting off these suitors, waiting for a husband that, by the time he comes back, it's been 20 years, right? It's 10 years to fight Troy, 10 years to come back.
People,
so they're...
Yeah, I mean, you would think, oh, no, he's dead. There's no, for her to hold out hope for that long, for 20 years, thinking that he's going to come back.
Yeah, I mean, I think
and everybody,
she's proven her devotion.
Right, I mean, and everybody keeps telling her, like, he's dead. You need to let it go. So that'd be tough, right? To have to be trying to cling on to hope, and everybody around you saying like, you got to let this hope go, and to still like want to hold on.
Yeah, I'm thinking of those old country songs, that cry about the father. He will go have good times. You will have hard times. There's almost this image of he's out being a child, in a lot of ways. Now we know that's not what's going on. But any aspect. I mean, we to look at this as Christians, we know childishness is spiritual immaturity, right? Anything that's keeping you from your vocation is some sort of immaturity. That is that is the not perfecting of your being, right? Which is, like Aquinas would say, the purpose of anything we're looking at it. Well, what's its mature form? So your mature form, what's Odysseus's mature form? Is it him at war? Right? Is that his full maturity? Is it him through the trials on the way home? Which I would note as men read this, take note of the goddesses that try to keep him from going back to his wife, because he has his eyes and his heart set on her. And the goddesses say to him, but I'm a goddess. I'm never going to be moody or die, right? I'm perfect. I will give you everything you want. I think men in the age of the internet, we know what that could mean. Like what the simple analogy for us, you don't have to go home. I'll give you whatever you want, whenever you want. It's just click away. I'm a goddess. Versus going home to your wife who's broken and waiting for you and surrounded with all sorts of problems. So absolutely, I think the feminine, he's trying to get to her. I mean, a true, authentic, his companion, his, I was trying to think of something better than other half, because that's really lame sounding, but
it's okay. We can run with that.
Okay. He's trying to get back to her. He's longing to return to her, and he does.
Right.
And I think to defeat the suitors at that point, that's not him in battle with any kind of worldly glory, with people cheering. That's his house. That's his wife. So to return to that feminine, who without him could potentially, I think, be the disorder of the son, right? They don't have a relationship as, Telemachus and his mother as man and woman. That's mother and child. And so those we have to cut those apron strings. So that relationship's not going to work. Penelope and the suitors, that's not going to work. Penelope and Odysseus, that's the better half.
Yeah, I like that parallel between Penelope and then the female goddesses like Calypso or even like Circe, right? And these kind of temptation scenes for Odysseus. Can you say though a little bit about, because I know right now someone is yelling at the podcast, because Odysseus is not exactly chaste, right? But then also like even on his journey home, without getting to the details, but as we watch it, it's like, yes, he survives great ordeals, but sometimes like his virtue, what is his virtue, and like what's his relationship to his men and things like this. So what about like one of the critiques I hear, or people read the Odyssey, and we get to somewhat in the Iliad too, is like, why would I read this to pull out some kind of virtue? He's clearly not a virtuous character. Like, why don't I just read the Gospels? Like, why would I read Odysseus?
Well, you need to read the Gospels closer. I mean, that's the great defender of the New Testament, is that our heroes are not perfect. I mean, that's their. That's why it's so good. I mean, I would say the exact same. I don't understand. In some ways, I get the critique. In some ways, I'm like, that's ridiculous. Would you apply those standards to yourself? That because your life has had some setbacks, there's no lessons, there's nothing to read there. And obviously, in poetic form, what Odysseus is to every man is the truth, which is us sliding back, which is us not exactly this or that virtue. But again, for us as Christian men, I mean, that the salvation of the story is to return home and to conquer the demons in your own home, and to set in order your place and to root yourself back, not in an adventure. There's a time for adventure. There's time for Telemachus to go out and have an adventure. There's time for Odysseus to have an adventure. But to have order in your place in your home, that's his salvation at the end. So everything that got him there was good, and everything that didn't was bad. But it's part of his learning and his purification. Absolutely.
Yeah, I find it, I think there was an analogous conversation that we had going through the Iliad about Hector, right? Because Hector seems to have, at times, this great virtue. At other times, he tends...
You met our friend who had sealed
controversial Hector hate.
Yes, we do have an unnamed friend in our Sunday Great Books who, while reading the Iliad, announced to everyone that he had sealed his hate for Hector.
Sealed it.
because of the perceived shortcomings of Hector's virtue. And I think some of the pushback...
I'm glad that I don't know him well, because then he might seal his hate for me. If he get my impression.
Well, I think that was something. So I want to set him aside because it's not fair that he's here.
There he is. Literally, just walking.
Did he walk here? Yeah. Oh no. Okay. So anyway, we're going to move on to a different topic. But no, I think that when we look at so setting our good friend aside, I think looking at Odysseus as we read that, I actually find him very analogous or a parallel to what we would find maybe in David, what we'd find in Moses, right? These characters I think we would refer to as heroes, characters that we would read for virtue training, but at the same time made colossal mistakes, right? I mean, committing adultery, setting up your own soldier to be murdered, right, is not exactly, high on the list of virtue. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the challenges here then is like you're dealing with the same human frailty, right, the same brokenness amongst the ancient Greeks, but they don't have the revelation of any kind of like, sacrificial system of redemption of the true God. They're coming at this not quite understanding, right, the reality of sin. So imagine like you're trying to be virtuous, but you don't actually understand the brokenness that sin has actually created inside of human nature, which I think that, obviously David, say, doesn't have the full picture, but even David in the Psalms is actually the one that gives us one of the first inklings of original sin, right, explicitly mentioned, because he talks about, right, I was born into this sin. He knows there's something wrong with human nature. And I think to read Homer, whether it's an Iliad or Odyssey, you realize you're reading with these really great-souled men in a lot of ways, but then they are one. I think this is a nascent conversation on what it actually means to be virtuous, right? What does it actually mean to be an excellent hero? Is it just prowess in war? Is it just Achilles, right? Is he the most virtuous because he can defeat everyone in a duel? Or is it someone that's more like Hector, right, that's fighting for Troy, has piety towards his family? Same thing with Odysseus. There's some parts that I think really infuriate me, right, about what he's doing. Why is he doing this? But at the same time, then I think there's good lessons you can pull out of it, in which he does triumph over some pretty serious temptations.
Yeah, and probably the things that upset you when you're reading it is when he violates the bonds that you think he has with his men, for example, or
or his wife.
Or his wife. When those things are out of order, right? Because the right order of virtue is always relational, right? I mean, we can't understand the virtue of charity or justice or any of it. We only can understand these in understanding how they're in right relationship with other people. That's literally the defining characteristic of them. So in a lot of ways, that's what he is looking for and trying to set right. I think the joy that we ought to have is in the end, him setting himself right with his father, with his son, and with his wife, is sort of, that's where he was headed. I mean, I don't know if you guys have discussed I don't remember where I read it about the famous story of John Sr. Having the discussion on the Odyssey with his friends in the Integrated Humanities program, and him with all these, hippie college students listening, and he's talking about the Odyssey, and he looks at them and he says, well, he's going home. Where's he going? He's going home. And he looks at all these college students and says, where are you going? Right. I mean, I just think, I don't know if he said it with that twang or whatever, but
right. I liked it though.
Yeah, where you going? Where you been at? That is why I think that's if the story just ended with, I don't know, exploits and war, that would be it's like what we were discussing about the Sword and Spade. It's like, you know what? I mean, that stuff's always exciting to talk about. The battles, they're always. But when the sword is beat into the plowshare, right? When you start to cultivate, and all of a sudden these things, we realize we're not after Valhalla, right? We're not after perpetual war and fighting. We're actually after the peace and tranquility of order, and how that's in our home, in our place, in our neighborhood. That's why, and perhaps because we know that's where we're headed. In the Odyssey, there's some comfort there. Spoiler alert. I don't know. That is, I don't know, just looking backwards at all those struggles, like, yeah, we're going to be able to relate with all of the deficiencies, I think, and find some, I don't know, hope and solace in that. But in the end, he's putting relationships. I mean, when you get to the end of your life, you're going to want to have these things with your father, your parents, your children, right, and your wife. You're going to want to have those things in order before you die.
Right.
The more and more I've been doing the Great Books like podcast and also like on Sunday Great Books, I've come to realize, even in this conversation, how important it is to read these books with other men or with other people. I mean, Homer is, this whole story was an oral tradition that has been passed down to aristocrats and things like that, and Homer has captured it to compile it to tell the story. But you two both have read this story, and you came out with two different angles of reading the same story.
But who was right?
Well,
please decide right now.
I'm not a relativist.
Please vote.
I'm not a relativist. But I think that it's important. This is
vote.
this is the beauty of reading good books together,
right?
And sharpening each other and being like, oh, well, I didn't realize I didn't really pay attention to the relationship between father and son here. I was more focused on this part, and
Well, we're learning how to read books again because I, growing up public school, I'm just trying to get through class. I'm looking for the answer. The teacher asked me a question. I don't know.
7.
And when you read it as an adult and as a man, all of a sudden you realize this is why it was passed on because this is something important that cannot be communicated to me in another way outside of this story. I mean, that's
right.
Mm-hmm.
It's actually liberating when you can start reading those. For me, it's been, okay, I can read this. I don't need expertise. What I do need help, right? I might need some help, but...
and it brings like real conversation that you can have with other people.
Yeah, you brought up Charlie again. We were riding in a car. We were on a pilgrimage, and there was a guy in the back, and Charlie and I were arguing over whether or not Jayber Crow was weird. So Jayber Crow is a Wendell Berry novel, and trust me, that's a good argument, whether or not he's weird. And this guy in the back, he's talking, and the magazine came up, and he said, "Well, why do you have a magazine?" And Charlie, I was thinking of these philosophical answers on like why we do, because reading on a page is better than you should not be so stupid. And Charlie just said, "When's the last time you heard two men arguing about a book?" And he said, "Like never." He said, "Is it important, worth doing?" "Yes." "Okay, that's why we have a magazine."
I like that.
Yeah.
And I like that a lot. I think, too, one thing that occurs to me, to build on Adam's point and what you were discussing, Jason, is that when you read a book like the Odyssey, Homer, I think, I tend to be very strong on Homer as the teacher. Homer is actually laying these layers here to try and teach you multiple things about human nature, about whether it's Odysseus or Telemachus or Penelope. Like they all kind of have their narratives that are intertwined. And so it's a book that lends itself to being reread, right? So just like I talked about the first time I read it, I was wrapped around the axle on trying to argue whether about Odysseus is a good or bad person, right? And I'm missing other main themes. I'm not really focusing on Telemachus' coming home, or his not coming home, his kind of maturation, coming of age story. But when you read it as a group, in a lot of ways, it's a substitute for reading the text over again.
Right.
Does that make sense? Because when you read for a group, so it's like if you and I are reading the Odyssey together, I, just because of my dispositions, right, are going to be really hyper-focused on these little details about Odysseus. I'm going to be hyper-focused on, hey, do you pay attention when he's told something or something happens to him and then later he repeats it to another person? Is he telling the truth? Is he lying? Or is he just casually leaving out some information that maybe you would want to know if you were the listener, right? Like, I'm hyper-focused on this where, like, you might be coming to the table and say, yeah, but look, what about like the aspect of fatherhood here? What's Telemachus going through right now as a son who, in the absence of any kind of like paternal guidance? And I think that's the benefit of reading it in a group, or as we're trying to supplement on a podcast like this, is that then reading it with the group is like you've read it multiple times because you've got multiple people bringing those perspectives to the table. And I think that's a healthy part of that discussion, that you don't have this kind of hive mind.
Or you have the other, a lot of us learn to read so that we don't look dumb in a group, right? So imagine though, if you're reading something, we actually flew into Tulsa. I said, and Margaret, Mary, my daughter and I, we landed and we were like, where's this on the map?
We're not that bad.
Yeah, but we're over in North Carolina where all the the hills and the state lines are all curvy. I'm like, I think it's one of the square ones over there. So we, and I said something joking. I thought how shallow that is. We need to look it up so we don't look stupid in front of groups of people, right? Which is a bad reason to read a book. But all of a sudden, when you're reading a book with someone and you get in like an argument over Hector, right? That's worth doing, and it's great. And you don't realize how shallow you read and think until you actually have a substantial conversation about something like this, and you go, "Oh, that's why people have been reading." As John Henry Newman would call a university, right? A group of friends. This is why friends read this,
right?
For good arguments. It's the best reason.
Yeah, and why it also can apply to our own lives, right? That we actually then there are these rich lessons. It occurs to me as well, as we're talking about virtue, we're talking about Penelope, is that, I'll probably butcher this, but, in the Greek, arete, right, virtue, like when you're dealing with that word in Homer, it's really at the beginning of what does that word mean. So even like we're kind of talking about like, is Hector the hero? Is Achilles the hero? Who's the hero? But even on like, your grammatical level, what does it mean when we say this is an excellent human? Like, what does that word actually mean?
Yeah.
Like, I think that, as we discussed in the Iliad, I think that Homer is actually offering Hector as a contrast to his Greek audience, to Achilles, and saying, hey, I don't think that, are we really understanding virtue correctly here? Mm-hmm. And one of the big points, actually, that Homer is starting to push his Greek audience to maybe reconsider what it means to be an excellent human being is in the Odyssey, he uses that word to refer to Penelope. Mm-hmm. And you can't use that word to refer to Penelope if it means excellent in war.
Right.
Right.
I mean, you can't help it. I think this is a pagan audience. Mm-hmm. That they would have thought, well, virtue is power. Power is divinity. Gods are powerful. They're powerful because they're gods, or gods because they're powerful. You apply that to Penelope, and it's like, well, what does that mean all of a sudden? Does she? What is her power? What's the nature, purpose? Does she have use for him? Or, I mean, that's a very good, I think it's just as in the pagan mind, that would have been almost a, just proto-Christian idea of this. Yeah. Of gentleness, of virtuous sacrifice, not just power, of salvation being coming home, not just going to war, of like all these things. They really are turned on their head for his audience. Mm-hmm. You can imagine why, Christians would have loved this book when it arrived in their hands, that this was something beautiful and amazing that preceded us, the way Socrates preceded us with things that we really needed.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, we've talked about this before, that I think that Providence actually was using Homer and using the Greeks to cultivate the world to be able to receive Jesus Christ, right? Because you get that meeting, that harmony between the Greeks and the Hebrews, sometimes actually quite violently, say like in Maccabees, but also sometimes with great harmony, say in like Sirach or the Book of Wisdom, right? Or all of a sudden, like, we should probably note that all of a sudden we have a New Testament that's written in Greek. Why is that
Jesus
true?
Would have been reading,
right? Yeah. Like why all of a sudden is the first Old Testament canon in Greek, right? With the Septuagint. So I really think that in a lot of ways, Providence really is cultivating the world through Homer, and then obviously downstream of him, the Greeks overall, to be able to have the capacity to receive the incarnation. Because when you see that word virtue, by the time it gets to Plato in, like, say, the Republic, he's talking about, say, the virtue of a knife, the virtue of a horse, the virtue of a slave, the virtue of a man, the virtue of a woman. Now this word has blossomed from how Homer, I think, tried to use it, insofar as, like, it actually just means the excellence of a thing.
Right, the thing doing it what the thing should do.
Right. It's I know that. So his classic example, right, of the knife is like, okay, well, what's the purpose of the knife? Well, it's to cut. Okay, well then what does it mean to be an excellent knife? Well, you'd have to be sharp. And I know it has to be sharp because I know its purpose is to cut. And therefore the vice, its viciousness, would be to be dull because it impedes its purpose. And obviously he pivots here with a wonderful question is like, oh, well then what does it mean to be a good man? Mm-hmm. Oh, well then to know whether a man is good, I have to know his purpose. Oh, well, what's the actual purpose of man? Right. And just gets us into this beautiful conversation in the Republic. And it all starts right here with this wonderful conversation between Odysseus and Penelope.
Right. Beautiful.
Hey, so how can they subscribe to Sword and Spade?
Well, hopefully by this airs, we still have a working website. We're notorious for having terrible websites because we're putting all our time into an excellent magazine.
That's right.
TheSwordandSpade.com.
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 Again, that's a wonderful name.
Yeah.
So any kind of just last bits of advice for people approaching the Odyssey for the last time?
Just approach it.
The first time?
Yeah, the first time.
Hopefully not the last time.
Just approach it. Just do it. Don't be intimidated. I think, and I'm speaking to myself not too long ago that, wow, there's a lot more than what I was forced through in high school to really, no fruitfulness that I can recall. It was only later that realizing, wow, this is something I should have read and should be reading a lot more.
Yeah, no, very good.
Jason, it's been a blast to talk to you, man. I appreciate it so much.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thank you.